And good morning, everybody. We're live. Thanks. Glad you're here. Pull up a chair. You made it through the week. My name is Bryan Armentrout, and this is the Food Safety Chat. And every Friday at this time, 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern, or whatever time zone you happen to be in, we go live on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter, and we discuss all things food safety. And every week I bring in an expert to have a discussion with me and interact with you. And if you're new to this channel, one of the things that you're going to notice is this is not a presentation. This is meant to be a discussion. And we get some pretty lively ones here that are a ton of fun. And today I'm really happy to have my good friend, Dr. Doug Marshall from Eurofins, the Chief Scientific Officer over there. So, that's doesn't get any higher than that, right? If you're the Chief Science Officer, you know, it's like the enterprise, right? You're looking into the thing and everything else, right? So how you doing this morning, Doug?
Fantastic, Bryan. And you?
Oh, can't complain, right? It's beautiful weather. It's looking pretty nice outside here in Colorado. Doug and I are both in northern Colorado. So I am in Loveland and he's in Fort Collins. So let us know where in the world you're at. It's always amazing on these chats, the locations of where everybody is joining us from. And that makes it so much fun. And one of the things that we like to do here at the beginning of the chat as well is have a ceremonial sip of your favorite beverage together. So please join Doug and I as we imbibe. Very nice, very nice. And I got my old, so I used to work for Boulder Brands, which is one of my favorite mugs. And they were acquired by Pinnacle, and then Pinnacle was acquired by ConAgra, and all of those type of acquisitions that occurred about 5 years ago. They were part of that. Good company. Enjoyed working for them. So one of the things that we're talking about here today is we pick a subject every week and we dive into it. Good morning, Pittsburgh. Lovely city. Pittsburgh is a really cool town. And we'll talk about a different subject. And today, when Doug and I were preparing for this chat, like, okay, what's one of those things here in the new year that if you're working on something and it's part of your goals for 2023, something that we can all do better. And that's something that's always crazy, right, Doug? And that's complaints, right? Everybody gets complaints. We wish we didn't, but actually it's not a bad thing, right? And how you work through those is super, super important. Good morning, Claire in Oklahoma. Graduated from CSU. So nice. And as Doug is aware, we had the Golden Boot here in Colorado, the Wyoming CSU football game. And refresh me on that, Doug. Who won that game?
Don't care, Bryan.
Well, I'll let everybody know. It was Wyoming. We have retained the Golden Boots. So all praise to Wyoming and our only collegiate or professional team in the state. You have to support them. So Kristen, Cheryl, Austin, Tim, always good to see Tim. And one of the things you'll notice too with this weekly chat is we're building this really cool community of people who are helping and supporting each other, which is really awesome because in quality, right, it's kind of one of these fields where we work for companies, but we also have a loyalty to the discipline of what we do because food safety is something that impacts multiple companies. It's just not isolated within one. Because if something happens within a particular company, it impacts that entire category. So it pays to build your skills, and that kind of really gets into the topic that we're talking about here today again, which is complaint management. And really with this, Doug, I think, with complaints, first is, do you have a process for complaints? And having a good process is super important. So we can kind of dive into this as well. So one of the things that I think, and I'll be really interested to get your thoughts on this as well, Doug, is one of the things that I always did with my complaint process is you first need to divide it into two categories, is your food quality complaints and then your food safety complaints, and then handling those completely separately. So when I ran quality assurance at large companies, you have lots of feedback coming from the marketplace. And it was really important that you had a method in place to make sure that the food safety complaints got the attention right away. And defining how those work is really important. And depending on your company, how do those things even come in? So are consumers contacting you via email? Are they calling your company? Believe it or not, some people still write. So when these type of things happen, how is that information getting to the company and how is it then being evaluated immediately? Because we all know as consumers, that if you contact a company, number one, you're ticked off about something. And most people don't complain, right? I know as a consumer, right? If I get a crappy, cup of coffee and I don't like it, I just go, yeah, that sucks. And I don't buy it again. But if it's something serious enough and I keep seeing it enough, then it escalates and I'm going to contact a company. And a lot of times with what's going on in the marketplace right now, right, we're seeing, as we mentioned, with Boulder Brands, mergers, acquisitions, layoffs, all these type of things that are going on, those mechanisms can become easily disrupted. So you need to make sure that those things are in place correctly. If that person who is handling those complaints is no longer working with the company, what happens, right? And we all know as consumers that if you express a grievance and you're not happy about something and you don't get a response, ooh, that's a bad thing.
Yeah, Brian, and think of it this way: with the proliferation of social media over all kinds of platforms, one disgruntlement going after a brand can mushroom cloud, and it becomes a pile-on event. And you may not be at all aware that your brand is being trashed all over social media if you don't have anyone who's actually monitoring these channels.
Ooh, that's a really good point. It reminds me of, do you remember the issue that happened last year with Lucky Charms, right? It was kind of one of these viral things where people started saying, hey, Lucky Charms made me sick and I threw up and I don't know why. And then other people started reading that and saying, yeah, me too. And then it just created this giant viral event, and nothing was ever identified that was wrong with the cereal.
Mm-hmm. And you'll also get people complaining about ingredients in products. They'll say, I just checked the ingredient list of one of my favorite products, and they have something like TBHQ, which might be added as an antioxidant. And because the average consumer has no clue what it is and why it's in the product, they just start this rampage about toxic chemicals in your products. And so unless you get in there and quickly defend your product, that too can be very harmful.
That's a good point. And well, yeah, there's activist groups out there as well. And particular ingredients, for whatever reason, people don't like. So different type of stabilizers, right? So carrageenan, right? A lot of people decided that they didn't like carrageenan and that it shouldn't be in products. So there will be other people out there who have active campaigns against these type of things. And to your point, which is a great one, you need to have people monitoring and managing these social media accounts, because you don't even know when somebody creates a Facebook group that says this company stinks, right? And then all of a sudden they're beating you over the head with this and you don't even know it. And they're doing that for a reason, right? And it gets back to what I had said earlier, which is people have to be pretty upset, right, in order to take those type of activities. And we've all been in those situations, right, where something happened, we felt that we've been wronged, and we want to take some type of action for that. So it's really important to stay ahead of those things. And on that consumer side, it can be really hard because consumers aren't really necessarily good at describing or even letting you know what the particular issue is, right? Because it's hard. If you get a complaint from a consumer that says, I tried your product and it sucks, what do you do, right? It's like, well, sucks how? What don't you like? And figuring those things out sometimes can be really difficult. So that's kind of one of the key differentiators between looking at complaints from a food safety standpoint and a food quality standpoint. Is the food safety piece is pretty easy, right? That's good or bad, right? It's like, I ate your product and it made me sick. Whoa, okay, that's serious, right? I need to look at that immediately to make sure that everything is okay. Food quality, you're looking at larger pools of information and figuring out what it is that the consumers are trying to tell you. And a lot of times within organizations, because that's so difficult, they become really internally focused, Doug, where it's like they get good at navel gazing internally, and they'll set up lots of parameters and technical information from R&D relative to the sensory attributes of the product and these type of things without taking that consumer aspect into account. And it's really, really important. And one of our main goals in quality is to make sure that we get that information from the consumers, that we're translating that back into the company so that they clearly understand what are those drivers and what do the consumers really hate. And figuring those things out is not easy.
Hey, Brian, I have a thought for you.
Yeah.
And when I'm asked to help our clients resolve issues like this, one of the first things I do is I interview those who are in management and interview those as many people as I can to get all the different perspectives. And one little indicator for me is the person who is the most defensive. That's the person I'm going to zoom in on in terms of what are they responsible for? What data do they have? What are they trying to hide? Why are they being so adamant that no, it's not my problem?
Wow.
So just a little thought there on when you're doing an investigation and you have all these multidisciplinary teams involved trying to resolve an issue. Just be, if you're part of that team, be very humble and be willing to accept that, yeah, it might have been an error on my team's side. And I need to go back and make sure that everything was under control. So rather than just be overtly defensive, just say, good point. We'll take a look at it.
And that's a good point, because it's one of the things that's really unique in quality assurance and food safety. If you're working in this area, we're one of the groups in the company that really has carte blanche to kind of go around and poke our nose into all kinds of different areas. And to your point, Doug, a lot of times people don't like that, right? Because if I'm going and asking questions of procurement and they're going, whoa, hold on a minute here, what, right? Their goals and their objectives may not be the same as mine, right? And you need to figure that out, because if in a company you've made the mistake of saying, okay, procurement, your goal and your objective and your bonus and your raise next year will be based on how cheaply you buy ingredients, ooh, you're setting yourself up for failure, right? Because to your point, which is a great one, is if I'm in procurement now and you're coming to me and saying, well, what are you buying and why are you doing this? Whoa, hey, who are you? Why are you questioning me? I'm doing what I've been told to do. Get off of my turf, right? And the procurement guy, from his perspective, and I'm just using procurement as an example here, it works for lots of different groups. If I found this cheap ingredient that is going to the plants and the plants are seeing all kinds of damage and they're seeing inconsistency in quality and is producing product, are you really saving money? Probably not, right? So you need to figure those things out really quickly. And one of the things that companies to realize, I think that's a great example of this, is that consumers, right, have a picture in their mind of what your product is. And this becomes even more important with those customers that are loyal to your product, right? Those heavy users, those people who are buying your products and consuming it every single day. People complain when things are different. It may be better, it may be worse, but it's different, right? And coffee is the example I've used before. I have a certain expectation. If I'm buying a light roast coffee at Costco and I've been buying this same bag of coffee for the last year, and I buy it and all of a sudden it's bitter or it's over roasted, I'm gonna really take note of that. And depending on my level of irritation, I may let the company know or not. And they may not even have a clue as to why that's happening. So within quality assurance, we need to clearly understand what are those key drivers. Why do people buy our coffee versus another company, and figuring that out and then managing that ruthlessly. So if you have a clear parameter around taste and your consumers, if your taste varies at all and bam, right, they're hitting that complaint button and you're not keeping track of that, you're asking for all kinds of trouble. And as Austin's saying here, new Coke, right?
Hey, Brian, I got a scenario for it. Maybe it's a question. And let's say, and this is a real world example. So this happened in about October. So this is a company that was ramping up for a holiday sale on a new product launch. And they were basically taking a formula that they were packaging in a large format container, and they wanted to create a new product where they're packaging in small individual serving cups. So they had been packaging the large volume container. It was a high bricks, high acid, no kill stuff in the process product. So they were relying on low water activity and high pH for quality. And they had just purchased the primary manufacturer. And they asked this primary manufacturer, okay, we've got this new formulation for the smaller cups. Please make up a gigantic quantity of this in bulk. We're going to ship this to a co-packer who's going to pack it off into the cups. Well, they were in a rush, obviously, to get product into warehouses and on the shelves before the holidays. So they went through the manufacturing process. They got the filled product off to several distribution centers, and the cups started bloating and exploding. Great. So the primary manufacturer was pointing fingers where? At the person, at the company that was filling the cups. They said, well, you obviously have a sanitation problem. Person filling the cups is, look, we're just following the instructions you gave us in terms of packing off and bulk packing and shipping this product. It's not our fault. So I was brought in to do an investigation. And after doing this interview process, after looking at it, all the typical things you would for a microbial spoilage issue. So we did the microbiology. Yes, it was full of gas-forming yeast. But where did the yeast come from? Why did the product fail? And, after digging through mountains and mountains of paperwork, what I discovered was it was a decimal point error that caused this failure. So they took the recipe from the large format. They did one formulation change. They went from an artificial colorant to a natural colorant. So, of course, that would be a trigger to say, what's different with the natural colorant? You do all the workup on that product, and it came back just fine. But when they were filling out the recipe sheet for the antimicrobials, so these were benzoate and sorbate, they were adding 1/10 the amount required to get stability of the product. And so again, catching a decimal point error when you do big investigations in a crisis mode requires a lot of diligence on someone to come in and actually sit there and do the math, look at this formulation sheet versus that formulation sheet, and see what's different.
Yeah, so several good points pop out at that. Is number one, don't jump to conclusions, right? So people were convinced without knowing or investigating that they knew the answer is, oh, it's clearly your fault. And those people, what are you talking about? We didn't do anything wrong. And being able to then step back and do an investigation and bring in someone who has a fresh set of eyes, right? So you were able to go in there then in this particular scenario and objectively look at it and say, okay, well, let's just kind of back up here and look at the whole picture. And what changed? What's different? What has been modified from the past? Because a lot of times too in companies, we tend to oversimplify. What's the big deal? We anybody can do this. It's just that we can do these 10 changes at once. Oh, really? We can. And anytime you add in multiple changes from a investigation standpoint, now you're confounding variables. So you don't know exactly necessarily what those issues are, which kind of gets back to the point originally in this conversation, which is you have to pick your battles, right? You can't go after every single complaint. So you need a mechanism in place to, when issues like this happen, you can quickly bring them to the surface. So as we talked about, food safety complaints, every single one of those needs to be looked at immediately. But when you start seeing trends, so the sooner this company figured out that, hey, what's going on with this bloating? All of a sudden we're getting bloating complaints, right? The sooner you can see that trend, the better off you're going to be. And you need to identify that. So odds are those complaints were coming from consumers. So now you have to look at your entire supply chain to figure out where the heck this happened, right? Was it in distribution? Was it in, and working your way back through the chain and then figuring out what is going on. And a lot of times too, in this particular example, and this is a really good one to point out as well, is there may be other motivations going on here as well. So in an issue like this, Doug, right, I'm assuming, right, with this, we're talking about big bucks, right? We're talking about large production runs, lots of inventory. Now we've got to make more stuff to make up for the stuff that we can't sell. We're behind on orders, rush. Now sanitation isn't being done properly. And there's a bill that needs to be paid, right? So all of a sudden there's a $500,000 bill that somebody needs to pay. And now both sides are motivated to make sure it's not them, right? So information may be difficult to get a hold of because they don't want to show that it was their issue.
Oh. Here's another scenario, and it's something that you will all experience at least once in your lifetime, and that's a foreign object in any product.
Yeah.
So a consumer discovers this, so it's obvious that it's there. The question you are all asking right off the bat is, and again, if you take the defensive mode, oh, well, that could not have come from our manufacturing facility. It had to have been an intentional customer addition. They're trying to scam us to get some money. What do we do?
Yeah. And this is a statistic that I bring up every chance I can relative to foreign material. More than half of foreign material complaints are for non-metal. So glass, plastic, rubber, bits of whatever. So if you're sitting in your plant saying, nah, I've got a metal detector, I'm fine, you're fooling yourself, right? And a lot of times these issues are tied to preventive maintenance, right? So, okay, we should be changing our gaskets in these lines every 6 months. Oh, boy, that line is really up there a long ways. Do I really want to get the scissor lift? Do I really want to? It looks fine, right? And who knows what's going on? And yeah, those foreign material complaints like that, exactly, right? It's all this back and forth. And you know, there are issues sometimes where it becomes clear who the agent of fault is. I had a foreign material complaint in a past company of mine where there was a large bulk tote of material that was sent to a customer, and they found a wallet, a whole wallet in the product with driver's license and everything. And that was presented to us by a customer. Oh boy, you talk about embarrassment, right? And so then we went back to that worker and said, hey, are you missing anything? Anything that you think you may need for your, oh, no, everything's fine. You got your wallets and everything? Oh, yeah. Right? And then we handed him back his wallet, right? So a lot of times in those particular examples, people are not necessarily motivated, you know, to step forward and say, oh, hey, guess what? I lost my wallet in product. Please don't fire me. No, right? They're gonna do this and hope nothing bad happens, right?
Yeah, and the proliferation of glove use, gloves finding its way into product is not uncommon. When you're slicing open bags or boxes, getting packaged material in. So all of these are preventable. All of these are actionable based on what the employee is going to do when it's, oh crap, it's my fault.
Yeah.
And they ought not be penalized for reporting it. And I think if there is some penalty involved, then that discourages self-reporting.
Oh, 100%, right? It all comes back to people and behavior. And if you're going to have a successful complaint investigation program, if you have a culture that tries to blame and say, oh, it was his fault, people are going to cover it up and you're going to be stuck. So you don't want that.
Yeah, and this also trickles down to maintenance. You talked about PM as a major contributor to foreign objects. So you've got plastic guards that are eventually going to deteriorate and break down. You're missing a nut or a bolt when you're reassembling equipment. All of these things should be observable issues. And again, you ought not just simply rely on a metal detector as your only default intervention to prevent physical hazards.
Exactly, right? So a great example of that immediately popped in my head was these plexiglass guards we put on machines. So, you know, the environmental health and safety group will look at different lines and say, okay, well, there's some risks here for people damaging their hands with pinch risks and things like this. So we're going to put this guard in place. Well, that area is constantly being utilized by that worker, right? So they're always opening and closing those plexiglass guards, and they get cracked and they get broken. And now FDA comes through your plant and says, hey, this plexiglass guard that's cracked, there's a piece missing. Where is it? How do you answer that, right? So you have to be very proactive on those type of things. And that kind of circles around indirectly back to our third group, right? So we have complaints from consumers and we have complaints from customers. Consumers are trying to tell you things and they may not be doing it clearly. Customers are telling you things and they may not be giving you the whole story. And then there's regulatory, right? So people, let's use your Facebook example from earlier, right? So people are complaining on Facebook, nothing is happening, the manufacturer isn't responding. Then they contact FDA and say, hey, listen, I bought this product and I think it made me sick. Well, now FDA may be showing up at your door and saying, hey, we have these consumer complaints for potential illnesses. Now they're in your plant doing a for-cause investigation. And anybody who's been through this knows that information is heavily redacted, right? It's very difficult to figure out from the information that FDA received and what they're giving you, what the heck happened, right? So now you're on your back foot right away. So you don't want to be in that position.
Want to talk about ways in which you can defend yourself from consumer complaints. They're going to happen. So how do you get to a point where you say, no, we're just not going to write you a check and have you go away. We're going to have evidence to say that it's simply not possible. And so if you remember, if you're old enough, like the two of us, there was syringes found in canned beverages. I don't remember who the brand name was. It doesn't matter, but it was a biggie. And so how do you protect your brand when a customer makes a complaint and shows you, hey, I found this syringe and here's the open bottle or the open can that I got it from? So how do you build a defense so that you can protect your brand, but also make an individual like this go away quickly because you've got scientific evidence proving that it's simply not possible? Mm-hmm. So again, you have to make a decision on how much do we invest to be able to protect ourselves versus how much do we spend to make this person go away. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, a lot of companies, that calculus is it's cheaper to pay off the complainant than it is to do a full internal investigation and prepare your defense package to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that your product could not possibly have caused the event that you're being accused of.
Yeah, that's a good example, right? So if there's a large object in the finished product and you have screens and filters and it's physically not possible for that to happen, you need to understand that and defend yourself. Because yeah, unfortunately, there's people out there who are trying to scam you, right? And you need to be aware of that. There used to be databases that consumer affairs groups would subscribe to, where they would track people who would do this to companies, right? So, they would try and scam company after company after company, right? Using all these different approaches to try and get money out of them. That was determined that companies couldn't do that. So they said, nope, you can't do that anymore. That's illegal. You can't track people like this. So we lost that tool. So you have to have mechanisms in place to make sure that the people who are interacting with the consumers are gathering the correct information. Part of this too, right, is a lot of times, do I get samples back? That's a hard call, right? Because if it's a microbiological contamination and the product's been opened, it's not really going to do you a whole lot of good.
Yeah, you're far better testing your retain out of that production lot than you are testing a sample that comes from a customer that's already opened the package.
Right.
Because then you don't have the cross-contamination, the prior manipulation of the consumer as a confounding factor.
Yep. And there are organizations out there, RQA comes to mind, there's other companies as well, where if you decide you need to get samples back from the consumer, they can do that. Because part of this then too, and this needs to be in your procedures, is chain of custody, right? Because to your point, if this does go to a litigation, right, you need to be able to show that you were able to properly maintain that sample. And a good way to think about that is, okay, if I'm in court, can I explain how the integrity of the sample was maintained? And you don't generally, if you're working for a company, those things don't come up very often, but they do. You need to be aware of that. And this is a good segue then into external resources as well. So I've said this before, and I'll probably say it on this chat again in the future, right? Is you need to have really good external resources, people like Doug and other people who can come in and help you with these things, and a good food lawyer, right? Because they're going to help you determine these parameters. If you're in a company and you have a legal group, a lot of times that group doesn't have dedicated resources for food law. They're looking at contracts, they're looking at human resources, all these other type of issues, mergers and acquisitions. You need a lawyer who specializes in food safety, so they can help you navigate these issues and make sure that you're handling these things correctly if it does escalate and become a larger issue.
Yeah, I'm going to give you another example of at least a service. I'm not trying to sell this to anybody, but just give you an example of how doing some analytics helps you get an out of jail card. And that is, if you have a foreign object, whether it is a dead mouse, a insect, there are some analytical tools that we can use to be able to tell you that that mouse was dead prior to being added product. So if they say, yeah, how did this live mouse get in? Well, you relatively easily say, particularly if you have a thermal process now, as a gross example, and gross in many different ways. If you have another foreign object, we can do some spectral scanning of the material, and even if you have metals, we can tell you what the alloy composition is, and we can compare that object fingerprint with materials that you have in your production facility. So if we can demonstrate that this object simply could not have come from this production facility, then again, that gives you the evidence you need to be able to say, this most likely was a consumer who threw this into the product just to go after us. So again, there are a lot of very sophisticated analytical tools out there that can give a sense if you need it.
Yeah, that's a really good example. Yeah, I remember one from my past where I had a consumer complaint where they had said the same thing, right? It's like, hey, I was eating your product and I found a bug. I'm like, whoa, right? And we started doing our investigation, and I'm like, well, where was the bug? Well, it was right on, it was right on top of the product I was eating. It's like, okay, well, did you just open it, or like, oh no, we were watching TV and it had been sitting there for a while. Oh, so it was like half empty. Yeah, it was about half empty, and so the bug was on top. Yes, okay, so it didn't have food on top of it, or no, it didn't have any of that. I'm like, and so I started asking the consumer about the type of bug, and it was this green grasshopper-like bug. And we started talking with external organizations, and we talked with our pest control company and things like that. And this particular bug wasn't even native to our manufacturing area. It was to theirs, right? And I'm like, so I contacted the consumer and talked with them some more and said, okay, so this particular bug, do these guys jump a lot? Oh yeah, they're everywhere and they jump around all the place. Really? And I walked them through this, and then they realized, oh, it jumped into my product when I wasn't looking. Yes, it did, right? And do you approach these type of things of, haha, gotcha, consumer, it's all your fault, you silly, dumb person? No, of course not, right? I helped work that consumer through that process to make them understand the source of this contamination, and that it wasn't us. And they were extremely grateful for that. They were embarrassed that they contacted us. And then they saw that. But the important part of that coming out of that conversation was building that relationship with that consumer and showing that we cared and that we were willing to assist and help them figure out, because we're consumers too, right? We don't want bugs in our food. And working with them to figure out what that source of that was really important.
Yeah, I'll give you another example. Let's say you get contacted by a consumer who is making a claim that they ate your product and they got sick. So they're claiming they got food poisoning. And one of the things that companies do a really poor job of is getting a complete case history from that individual. And I'll give you the reason why. Most people who are going to make a food safety complaint on food poisoning, they have a very strong sense of recency. So I, put the package in the microwave, I nuked it for 3 minutes, I waited 1 and I ate it. And then 30 minutes later, I got sick. So I got vomiting, I got diarrhea. Well, with the exception of Staph aureus enterotoxin, there are no foodborne pathogens that can deliver that fast of an acute symptomology after consuming the food. But that is the consumer's natural tendency, is to say, my illness was caused by the last thing that I ate, and
Yep.
that happened to be your product, so that's why I'm contacting you. So finding out what they ate along with your product, what they ate for breakfast, what they had for lunch the day before, what they had for dinner, if you could get a week's worth of food history, then you're going to find there is a lot of other products that this consumer ate that could spin reasonable doubt.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I had fresh sprouts on my sandwich 2 days ago. Oh, well, okay. We have this long history and continuing history of sprouts being involved in foodborne outbreaks.
Yeah.
We don't have any associated with our product. So again, this information gathering is your friend, and the more information you can get about case histories, number one, the better able you now can go back to your product and your process and do some discovery work, because when you know that case history, it allows you to make assumptions on what foodborne disease agent could have possibly led to this. Was it a preformed toxin? Was it an infectious microorganism? Was it a toxic chemical exposure? Was it a foreign object? Right? So it allows you to narrow down your focus to things that are more likely to have caused this consumer's condition. And then you do discovery and figure out if you have that problem under control or not under control.
That's a great example, right? And there's some key points to pull out of that for everyone who's listening to this, is having a methodology in place, right? So odds are, if you're working in quality assurance, you're not the person answering the phone when the complaint comes in. So who is answering that phone? And if you're in a large company, it's probably a company that specializes in these type of activities, call centers and things like this. How are you training them, right? Because if they get this call from the consumer that says, I ate your product and it made me sick, and they don't know how to ask these questions and do it diplomatically, it's going to hurt the relationship, right? So if the consumer calls and says, I ate your product 30 minutes ago and it made me sick, and the consumer affairs person says, well, it's not our product, that's really stupid, it can't be us because nothing happens that fast, thank you, have a nice day. Whoa, that's bad consumer relations, right? You have to show that you care and that you're working and figuring out why these type of things are happening. And how do you then develop processes to help gather this information? And again, consumer complaints for quality issues versus food safety issues, right? You're looking at gathering different types of information. And right now we're talking about the food safety side of things. So when you're gathering this information, what type of questions have you created for that team so they can extract this information? Because if you ask me what I had for dinner 3 nights ago, I don't know, right? Food, right? Okay, well, did you have this particular condiment or things like this again on your product? Oh yeah, well, yeah, I guess I did have that, right? And being able to work these things out so we can gather that data. Your first pass is going to be your best one, right? You need to establish that relationship and start building that information so that it can come back to quality assurance and say, okay, do we have an issue here? Do we have a trend? Is there something that we need to immediately jump on top of? Because if you have to go back to that consumer and continually ask more questions, it makes you look unprofessional, and they're going to lose confidence in you. And to your point, Doug, they are then going to go on Facebook and say, start ranting on Facebook and saying, this company stinks and I can't believe how terrible this product is and it made me sick and don't buy this, right? Now you're shooting yourself in the foot.
I'll give you another scenario that I think is probably one of the most challenging. Let's say you're not manufacturing product for retail, but for food service. So you've got a food service operator that is being pointed at by one or more consumers as causing a foodborne outbreak. Now that food service operator, they're going to say, no, it's not our problem. It's our supplier's problem. So again, how do you defend yourself when your customer is now pointing the finger at you as the deliverable of an unsafe food or ingredient? So it's kind of a pass-through consumer complaint through your customer.
Right. That's a good point. I think, right, this gets back into, right, and this dovetails in with enhanced traceability, because as a manufacturer, you're making the food, and then it goes to the warehouse, and it goes to distribution, then it goes to a broker, and then it goes to a job, whatever, right? There's this giant supply chain to get to that end user. And to your example, right, for a food service application, and it's going to a restaurant, and that food goes out to delivery on a small truck that's bringing it to these different restaurants from the wholesaler, and it gets delivered in the morning, and now it sits out back behind the restaurant for 4 hours or longer before it gets put in the fridge. You have no idea this is going on. And a lot of times too, on the food service side, right now you've got another layer in between you and the consumer, and they have that financial interest as well. So now they're coming back and saying, hey, you produced a bad product, and I'm going to bill you for that. Right now that investigation becomes harder.
Yeah. And one good way to defend yourself is, again, interview that food service operator. So if it's a national brand and they've got multiple stores in the region that are all sourcing the same lot from you, you could come back and say, okay, well, if it truly is our product or our ingredient, were other stores affected? And if the answer is no, then that's a good piece of evidence that says that it's not my product, it was the behavior and something that you did in your store that contributed to this situation.
That's a really good point. And you know, as consumers, we've all been in grocery stores, and you look in the coffin cases or the stand-up coolers or things like this, and you look at that thermometer that's monitoring the temperature in there, and it's saying 55 degrees or whatever, and you're like, ooh, right? There's all these different factors you need to figure out. And so that kind of goes back to, you know, looking at the big picture and stepping back. And a lot of times when you have these mystery type issues like this, you need to pull in those fresh eyes and have people who can help you ask these type of questions and look at it from a different perspective. Because sometimes you're looking at it from that quality assurance viewpoint and saying, oh, no, I've got great procedures and it's not us, right? And if you do that, sometimes you're going to miss things. An example I have from my past is we had this really weird mystery issue. So I worked for a large dairy company, and we monitor our milk quality really, really closely down to the farm level. And we would look at particular milk routes. And there was one milk route in upper New York State that kept having high incoming micro results on the raw milk. And we're like, what the heck is going on? And so we're working with the regional people at the co-op, and we're talking with all kinds of sending samples out for micro. We're talking with the farmer directly on the phone and saying, hey, listen, are you sanitizing your bulk tank? Are you doing your breakdown of your valves? All the fantastic operation. He was doing everything correctly. And he was getting very frustrated, and rightly so, right? This is his livelihood. And we were penalizing him because of the poor milk quality. And what we had to eventually do, and I'm glad we did this, is I'm like, okay, we need to get some eyes there to see what's going on. And I sent one of my regional quality people along to check this out. But the thing that we did correctly, and in retrospect, it was sheer luck, is let's send her along with the milk route driver to see what's going on the milk route. Maybe there's something there that we're not seeing. And so she met him at the reception and the co-op location and checked out all the information for the truck, and the washes were fine and everything was good. The driver had been driving for a number of years, and he was driving the same route and knew all the people on the route and everything else. He gathered all his supplies up, and he had his ice and his whirl packs and all these type of things that you need for proper microbiological sampling. And so she went along with him on the route, and they went to the first stop, which was the place that we were having the problem. And so he got out of the truck and prepared everything correctly and put his gloves on and sanitized them and all these type of things. Went to the bulk tank to get the sample and took out the whirl pack. And so if you're not familiar with whirl packs are small plastic bags that are sterilized, and you have a small built-in twist tie, and you tear off the top, and then you can open that bag and take your sample. So he pulled out his whirl pack bag, and he tore off the top, opened it a little bit, and then went like this, Doug. And she went, ah! And the driver's like, what? And that was it. That was it. And we would have never, ever found that if we hadn't taken the time to go out and put boots on the ground and watch, right? He had no idea, right? We could have interviewed him on the phone for 2 days and asked him about his process, and he never would have recognized that he was doing that incorrectly.
Mhm.
It's crazy, right? Sometimes it's those little small things, and if you don't see them, you're going to miss it, right? And so you can have all the great tools, and I'm not, dissing on tools, right? So your 5 whys and your fishbone diagram and all these type of things are great, but if you're doing that in a bubble and you're just doing it yourself, you're kind of fooling the system, right? You need to bring in additional people, and that's why it's really important to have a good process in place, because you need to figure out when is the right time to pull in those additional resources. Because as we talked about earlier, when you're dealing with consumer complaints, you're getting lots of information and it's not the best information. So you have to be able to parse that out and figure out, when do I hit the button and bring in that team to help out, because those perspectives are going to help a ton.
So I've been teaching HACCP and process controls my entire career. And one thing that I've always preached, and I've heard other preachers like me share the same story, and that is, when you are getting quality defect complaints, don't forget to ask questions about the food safety implications of that evidence.
Oh.
So is it time temperature control somewhere in the distribution chain that could impact whether or not you have something like Listeria monocytogenes under control on a refrigerated product? If it's a cooked product, again, do you have potential for cross-contamination in your facility? So what are your sanitation SOPs like? Are they actually working, or are they contributing just enough that could lead to short shelf life? Well, if you're contributing spoilage organisms, what is the likelihood you could also be contributing pathogens? So a lot of people, when I do CAPA report and questions, and I look at those, with the spoilage issue, a lot of times people are not asking the food safety questions.
That's a really good point. Yeah, because there's stuff growing, you don't necessarily know what's growing. And this is always kind of something that's interesting as well too, right? If you're just doing, a standard plate count and you're growing up stuff, you're not typing those things. You don't know what they are. Who knows what's in there, right? So you need to be careful with those type of things as well. So, and hidden in your question, and you've mentioned this, quite a bit earlier as well, is looking at these processes and being able to step back and say, okay, what's changed, right? Maybe the ingredients, maybe procurement's buying something new. Maybe there's been a modification to shelf life. Maybe there's a new piece of equipment. Maybe the person who's ran that piece of equipment in that plant for 20 years retired, right? And now a new guy's running that equipment and he's not exactly sure what to do. What has changed? A lot of times within companies, there's an assumption that it's the equipment that makes the product. It's not. It's the people. I worked in a company in the past where they had moved some production equipment from one plant to another plant on the other side of the country. And the assumption is that the new people in the new plant could just, go in and run this equipment. Well, they couldn't, because the people who were at the old plant knew the tricks of that machine. It was kind of a squirrely machine. Sometimes it wouldn't seal quite right, and then they knew what to keep an eye on, and they would keep this thing running. They didn't take the people from the old plant to the new plant to train the new people. And as a result, we had all kinds of product that was leaking because of bad seals, which then, right, you have a gas flush product. Now micro is growing, right? What micro is growing? And you have this big issue. And in those type of situations, now the company is in a difficult spot, because that inventory that they manufactured is now not good, which means they need to make more product to make up for the product that failed. And now they also have the orders that are behind that as well too, right? So it kind of starts cascading. And when companies get behind, what happens, right? Other things get shorted. All right. So now we don't have as much time to clean. Now the production staff is stressed out because they're working extra hours. Now the QA group is trying to figure out what the heck is going on with these seal failures in the product. These things all interact together, and you need to be able to step back and look at this. And a big chunk of this is time, right? And you had said this earlier, Doug, and it was a really good point, is a lot of times we jump to assumptions, right? It's like, oh, it's this, right? And then we go from that assumption to then draw the conclusion that we want, right? And if there's one thing from my viewpoint, if I have a complaint, right, because as a manufacturer, I would issue, complaints against other people as well, sometimes suppliers or things like this. And if the response came back a few days later, number one, oh, that was really fast. And that response says, operator error, retrained operator. Oh, red flag, red flag. These people didn't do jack squat, right? So easy to blame the operator. Why? Why was there operator error? And was there?
I didn't train them effectively. That's why.
Like they're just trying to make the problem go away, right? And if you have a trend, you need to be really, really careful when you see that type of behavior taking place.
Yeah, this kind of gets to a food safety culture item that you should think about just in terms of your philosophy of handling complaints. Mm-hmm. This is a gift to you. It's a gift because it forces you to look at all of your systems. And if you are just doing the easy thing, well, Johnny didn't push the right button, so we're going to retrain Johnny. Well, if that's in your CAPA report, what evidence do you have that this isn't going to recur? Have you looked at your training to decide whether Johnny was taught to do it a different way? It wasn't Johnny's fault. It was the instruction's fault. Well, how did the instruction get off? Was it the original trainer is no longer there and they meant to do it some other way, but that's not what the SOP says, right? So all of these, you talk about 5 whys. These are gifts for you to challenge your systems. I mean, if everything is working well, which is rare, but if it were, you in quality management or food safety management would have the easiest job in the whole wide world. All you have to do is check your numbers and sign off on the paperwork at least once a week to be FSMA compliant. And then, you can take your kids to the soccer match at, early in the afternoon.
Right.
But these are ways in which you can get your whole team together and start snooping around your operation and figure out, do we have everything under control? Not just the one thing we think might have contributed to this consumer complaint, but everything in your system.
Exactly. Because, the worst scenario you don't want to be in is you have a work instruction that is incorrect and a new person comes on board and the supervisor says, did you read the work instruction? Yeah, I read that. Okay, well, it's all crap. It's wrong. Here's how I want you to really do it. And you're going off the assumption during the investigation that work instruction is correct and it's being followed. And if you don't go out and do the legwork, you're going to find out a very nasty surprise at some point in time. So as Corey says here, you got to think about your systems, right? And so part of this is, as management, that's why we're here. Our job in management is to make sure that we have the time to sit back and think, right? We're being hired and we're in our roles to solve problems. We're not here to do the day-to-day stuff, right? And so the farther up you get in the organization relative to these type of activities, the more important that becomes. You need to be able to step back, and because that's a strong temptation, right? And it's woven in with what you had just said, Doug. If I'm a quality manager at a large plant and my entire day is stuffed full of meetings and I'm there 12 hours a day and I have to fill out all kinds of documentation and paperwork and all these type of things, I don't have time to think about this stuff. And you have to really concentrate and think and challenge. And if it's a serious enough issue, right, bring in a team to deal with these type of things. And guess what? If their day is the same as your day, they don't want to be there, right? They've got other crap that they need to do. And you're going to be off on the wrong foot. I had a really good quality manager in my past, brilliant guy, right? He knew his plant inside and out. he knew more about the filling machines than the maintenance crew, which drove the maintenance guys nuts because, they could never BS him. But as a result of that, he would spend his time working on machines and helping out on the lines and do these type of things. And it would drive me crazy. And I would tell him, I'm like, no, that's not why you're here. You are here to think. You are here to help make the plant better. Your job is to look at things and say, all right, 6 months to a year from now, I don't want to be on the same treadmill. How do I put things in processes and procedures and challenge what we're doing to make it better? Right?
Hey, Bryan, I got a question.
Yeah.
And this is motivated by a comment that Jill put in the chat box. So we've talked about chemistry, we've talked about biology, we haven't talked much about physics. So her question is, I hate plexiglass. So I want to spin a scenario for you. During COVID, a lot of manufacturers who employed a lot of line employees put plexiglass barriers at workstations.
Oh, yes.
So just a thought question. So this was an action taken in response to a respiratory disease that many companies were really good hosting this amongst their employee core. So with these workstations, with these plexiglass barriers, my hypothetical question, everybody, is how easy is it to keep those clean and sanitary? How easy is it to clean and sanitize your food contact surfaces that are just on either side of that barrier? And how easy is it for personal hygienic practices to be implemented when you have these physical barriers? So I think Jill's comment was related when we talked about, a breakage hazard getting into product. But think about the consequences of this emergency intervention, what that might have on food safety and food quality.
Right. Now, that's a really good point. And so that goes back to one of the first questions you should be asking if you're looking at these type of things is what has changed, right? So, okay, we have these new barriers in place. People are breathing on them all day long or whatever. How are we cleaning these things, right? And a lot of times the procurement group was going out and trying to source this stuff in a market where everybody was trying to source this stuff. And they were finding what they could find. It's like, okay, well, there's this cheap, crappy, kind of flimsy plexiglass, but it's going to have to do. What about masks, right? Okay. Do people wear a mask for a little while and then change it out for a new mask? Nope. Right? People you see them in the cars, right? People hanging their mask inside cars and wearing this thing for God knows how long, right? On and off and on and off. And how has that impacted food safety in these areas, right? You need to be able to step back and look at these things with fresh eyes. And during the middle of the pandemic, right, this is a perfect example. And it's a great one, Doug, because everybody was stressed out. It's just like, oh my God, right? Well, food production can't stop. How do we make sure that we're producing a safe product? And how do we protect our employees? And layer on top of that all kinds of different things that we're swirling to is like, oh my God, can COVID survive on food? Yes, no, don't know, right? People were watching off their boxes when they would bring them home from the grocery store and things like this, right? Because we didn't know. So people reacted in the other direction, and which then could then translate over into your complaints. It just, you need to look at these things with fresh eyes. And that's why, conversations like this, and hopefully we've been able today, as we kind of draw this to a close, is we've helped you think about things in a new way, because that's what complaint investigation is all about, is being able to step outside of how you're normally looking at things and then looking around and saying, what's really going on here, right? Because if you jump to the conclusion of it's well, we just need to train the employee and you move on, you're failing, right? That's not the right way to approach these things. And yeah, to Corey's point here, in a lot of ways, these barriers were more emotional than anything else, right? And there's lots of places that we go in the community as we're doing our daily things where these barriers are still in place, right? My bank still has, these weird plexiglass things in place, right? Why? I don't know, right? These things kind of just become ingrained in how we do things. And sometimes it's not even really going to help. And so with that, I'll kind of close up my thoughts, but I want to give you the last word here, Doug. Anything you'd like to add? Or?
No, well, thanks for the conversation today, Bryan. Thanks for the feedback from the attendees. Those were good prompting questions and comments. So hopefully we've given you some motivation to take consumer complaints seriously and exploit them for your benefit rather than considering them a pain in the ass.
That's a great summary, right? Because within an organization, my final thought on this as well is very similar, is that use consumers, right? They're an incredible tool to make sure that the organization understands what's important, because a lot of times we become insular. So you need to be able to break through that and use this information from consumers and attend talks like this to help give you a new perspective. It's incredibly valuable. And that's why with my locals group, that's one of the things that we're doing there, right? Is I post recalls and information and, oh, hey, guess what? FDA came out with a new food code. Did you know that, right? That's how we cross-pollinate and share this information, because it's all about perspective and how we're continually improving, right? That is not a catchphrase, right? So the locals group is free, and I'm going to try and put the link in here. We'll see if this works again. It's the Food Safety Foundation.locals.com. It's free. Please join up and help us with this and get those new perspectives on food safety. So awesome, Doug. I love having you on. Your expertise in these areas is unparalleled. And if you need help on things, please, reach out to Doug. Doug Marshall is at Eurofins. Pretty easy to find him. So I've used him myself in the past, and he's one of the best guys out there. So thanks again, Doug. Thanks, everybody. Hope everybody has a great weekend. Thanks again for attending and putting forth your time to help with these type of activities and spread your knowledge. And we will be back here next week at the same time. So 8 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Mountain, 10 a.m. Eastern. There we go for the next food safety chat. And we'll bring another guest on and have a great conversation. So in the meantime, enjoy your weekend. Doug, have a great one as well. And we'll see everybody back here next week. Thanks, everybody.